Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're diving into episode 6 of The Rise of Qin, The Fall of Haojing. In this episode, we'll uncover the complex events surrounding this historical catastrophe and explore its lasting impact on Chinese history. Now, when we talk about Qin's origins, history often credits a man named Feizi as the founding figure. But the truth is, after Feizi, Qin remained obscure for a long time, with little real influence. The real turning point came with Duke Xiang of Qin. It was after the fall of Haojing that Duke Xiang, with his political savvy and some rather unconventional methods, escorted King Ping of Zhou to the east. This single act earned Qin a place on the political stage for the first time. So what exactly was the fall of Haojing? Well, that's where things get complicated. Historical records contradict each other, and over 10 different versions of this event exist. Even within records of the grand historian, Shiji, the accounts in the annals of Qin and the annals of Zhou don't match up. This inconsistency reflects just how difficult it was for ancient historians to piece together the truth. Even Sima Qian, one of the most renowned historians of ancient China, couldn't provide a definitive answer. As time went on, the story of the fall of Haojing became even more tangled, giving rise to famous legends like the laugh worth 1,000 gold and the beacon fire trick. While these tales are fascinating, their historical accuracy is highly questionable. So, what really happened? To get closer to the truth, we'll start with the version recorded in the Annals of Qin. According to this account, internal conflict had been brewing within the Zhou Dynasty for decades. These struggles dated back to King Xiao of Zhou, as different factions fought for control. But it was under King You of Zhou that tensions reached a breaking point. His choice of heir became the trigger that finally pushed rival factions into open confrontation. At its core, the dispute over the crown prince wasn't just a family matter. It was the result of deep-rooted political rivalries. And in fact, this power struggle wasn't even caused by King Yu. By the time he came to power, the conflict had already been festering for years. His personal affairs merely provided the excuse that opposing factions needed to go to war. And, once that happened, things spiraled out of control, leading to the events we now read about in history books. Meanwhile, the balance of power was shifting. The feudal lords of Zhou were growing stronger, and the king could no longer keep them. Check. 4 major warlords started competing to control the Zhou throne. Now let's break down these different factions, starting with the northwestern power block. This may sound familiar. If you understand what happened here, you'll notice that history tends to repeat itself. Again and again, throughout China's dynasties, we see the same patterns play out. So who were the northwestern forces? The key player here was the state of Shen. Shen Hao, the ruler of Shen, had already built a semi-independent power base. He controlled the strategic San Pass, commanded his own military forces, and had strong allies backing him. On paper, Shen Ho was simply King Yu's father-in-law. But if we look deeper, his background tells us something much more important. He represented the rise of regional military power as the central Zhou authority weakened. This kind of powerful warlord, commanding his own army, would become a recurring threat to central governments throughout Chinese history. Back in the time of King Xiao of Zhou, when they first joined the Zhou Dynasty, they were extremely loyal. But by the time of King Yu of Zhou, their reliability was no longer guaranteed. Although King Yu married the daughter of Shen Ho, making him his son-in-law, this was actually a political move. He did it to pacify Shen Hao and manage their existing tensions. The marriage wasn't about love. It was about keeping Shen Hao in check. The second major faction, from the perspective of the Zhou court, was the southern power. Their representative in the royal court was the state of Bao. Yes, the very same Bao from the legendary story of Bao Si. This state controlled Wu Pass and represented the newly conquered southern forces of the Zhou Dynasty. King You of Zhou was neither foolish nor weak. On one hand, he sought to appease the old aristocratic frontier guards like Shen, but on the other, he was also actively cultivating his own power base, and that was Bao. However, a conflict broke out between the daughter of Shen and Bosei, the princess of Bao. When King Yu had to pick a side, he chose Bao. This decision reveals his true priorities. Between two border defense forces, he clearly favored his new allies over the old ones. The third major faction represented the northern frontier forces north of the Yellow River. This was the state of Guo. At this time, Jin had not yet emerged as a dominant power, and Guo was the key player. Originally enfiefed by King Wu of Zhou, Guo had long served as the guardian of Hanggu Pass, the strategic gateway to the Central Plains. The villain in the famous story of the beacon fire trick, Guo Shifu, was actually the king of Guo. These factions were all active in the Zhou royal court, and they were evenly matched, locked in a deadly struggle for power. The fourth faction was Zheng, a state ruled by the aristocratic Ji clan, the same bloodline as the Zhou royal family. However, compared to the other three, Zheng was far weaker. So weak, in fact, that its military strength was almost negligible. But despite its small size, Zheng was backed by a powerful network of Zhou nobles. Surprisingly, after the chaos of the disaster of Haojing, this weak and seemingly insignificant state of Zheng emerged as the biggest winner. How? Because when the three major factions all collapsed in the chaos, Zheng was the only one left standing. And that's how they gained control over the Eastern Zhou court. There's a Chinese saying, when there's no tiger in the mountain, even a monkey can become king. This is exactly what happened. After the fall of the great aristocratic clans, the once overlooked Zheng rose to power, turning the Zhou dynasty into something entirely different. This is why many historians believe the Eastern Zhou was a downgrade compared to the Western Zhou. During the Western Zhou, the royal court was protected by powerful nobles. The king might not have liked them, but at least his authority was respected. However, once those nobles were gone, later Zhou kings lost their dignity and had to endure constant humiliation. But why did this internal conflict within the Zhou royal family spiral out of control in the first place? It all comes down to the role of the Zhou king. The Zhou dynasty was built around a single core principle. The king was the ultimate arbitrator of noble disputes. If conflicts arose between vassal states, it was the king's job to make a ruling. And once he did, everyone had to obey. This system ensured stability, but now the king's authority was in decline. If he couldn't even keep his own family affairs in order, how could the nobles trust him to settle disputes fairly? Eventually, the Zhou king stopped being the referee and became a player in the game. Instead of judging conflicts, he was now fighting battles. And in a fight, anything can happen. Because unlike a referee, a player can lose. During the stable years of the Zhou dynasty, these factions all tried to curry favor with the Zhou king, hoping to use his authority to rule in their favor. This reflects a traditional political structure in China where the king was the referee and the vassals were the players. A country can only exist in one of two states. The nobles fight among themselves. If the nobles aren't fighting each other, then there's trouble, because that means they're fighting the king. Now, during the reign of King You of Zhou, he wasn't actually doing a bad job at playing this game. The four factions were in constant conflict, and he managed to keep them at odds. So where did things go wrong? King Yu believed himself to be a strong and capable ruler, and he wasn't content with just being a referee. He wanted to be a player himself. That's where he made his fatal mistake. Instead of staying neutral, King Yu took sides and joined the fight. He formed an alliance with Guo, Bao, and Zheng, planning a 4-against-1 attack on the strongest faction, the state of Jin. On the surface, this seemed like just another royal succession dispute. But in reality, these states had been at odds for a long time, and this was simply an excuse for open war. Ironically, the real instigator of this conflict was likely King Yu himself. He wanted to reclaim his authority and prove that he was not just a nominal ruler, but the true master of the realm. This difference in mindset is critical. In traditional Zhou thought, the king was the supreme ruler among the vassals, a first among equals. But King Yu saw himself as the absolute ruler of all under heaven. This one-word difference, from supreme ruler among vassals to ruler of all, was the root of his downfall. The decline of Zhou wasn't just because the vassals were growing stronger. It was because a Zhou king overreached his power. Western Zhou collapsed because of one overly ambitious ruler. King Yu failed to recognize that the era had changed. The vassals were no longer obedient subjects. They were rising powers, their own. Yet he still insisted on playing the role of an absolute monarch. And so, a war broke out. At first, this seemed like a family feud. Shen had 2 daughters. One was married to King Yu, the other to his cousin. The king of Zheng was actually King Yu's uncle, making his son King Yu's cousin. And that cousin had also married into the Shen family. So now, 2 sons-in-law were rebelling against their father-in-law. Supporting King Yu were Zheng, his uncle's state, Bao, his other father-in-law's state, and Guo, which had intermarried with the Zhou royal family for generations. The more you look at it, the more you realize this was all just a messy family fight. It was a war between in-laws. 3 aristocratic families, all deeply tied to the Zhou royal house, were now tearing each other apart. At first, Shen was at a severe disadvantage. It was 4 against 1. Guo and Bao sided with the king. Zheng was also on the king's side. His own 2 sons-in-law had turned against him. Seeing no way to win, Shen had to seek help, and that's when he turned to the Qin people. Now, what was Qin's stance? At this time, Qin was still a border people, and when Shen sought their aid, the Qin leaders reportedly refused to even meet him. Their message was clear: we have nothing to do with Zhou politics, and we're not getting involved. Qin was asserting its independence. It was no longer just a border guard for Zhou. With no other choice, Shen turned to the most powerful nomadic tribe of the western frontier, the Quanrong. That decision changed history. Shen once the guardian of the western frontier, suddenly became the vanguard of the very barbarians he once defended against. The Western defense system, which had been in place since the reign of King Xiao of Zhou, collapsed overnight. With Quanrong and Shen's combined forces, the capital Haojing was exposed. King You of Zhou was defeated. The royal city fell. King Yu was killed. The infamous beauty, Bo Si, and her young son were executed. The kings of Guo and Zheng also died in the battle. Shen had effectively wiped out all his enemies, but now he had a new problem. What to do with the Quanrong? They had come to destroy, and they weren't leaving. Shen was now in a very difficult position. And this is where the next chapter of history begins, because in the midst of this chaos, a new force is about to rise. Next time, we'll talk about the emergence of the Qin people, starting with Duke Xiang of Qin and his legendary journey to save the Zhou royal family.